Hello, everybody. Welcome into another week of Countdown to Kickoff here on Jocks 94.5. I'm Conrad Van Order, joined by Damian Mitchell. Of course, each and every week, Molly Robinson holding things down for us behind the scenes here. And we are brought to you by our friends at Dread River Distilling Company. And Damian, yesterday, we had the opportunity to go out there and visit with Susan and Josh and some of the other staff there at Dread River. And first off, grade A hospitality. It was an absolutely fantastic experience getting to sample all of their different spirits, get to do a little taste test out of the kitchen, get a behind the scenes tour of kind of their whole distilling process and what goes into the creation of new drinks and new spirits and just the operation as a whole over there. I was very, very impressed, and I'm convinced that if you go there, you will be impressed as well, because they have everything from their handmade cocktails with all of their ingredients that are made in-house. We had the Birmingham Fog yesterday, which was absolutely fantastic.
Delicious.
A little bit of a different spin on I guess an old-fashioned with I don't even know. I'd never seen it before, but they smoke it in house, and they hook it up to the glass, and they're able to smoke it right there at the bar for you. It was absolutely incredible. Got to try their burger, their quesadilla, Nashville hot chicken tacos as well. Absolutely phenomenal experience. So again, appreciate our friends at Dread River Distilling Company for sponsoring Countdown to Kickoff, and you can go visit them at 2400 7th Avenue South, right down there in Birmingham, and be sure to tell them that you heard about them from Damian and Conrad right here on Countdown to Kickoff. All right, Damian, well, let's get into a interesting week here. A week ago today, we were here doing this show and kind of breezing over one matchup in particular, which was the Alabama-Vanderbilt matchup. As we now know, Vanderbilt, the winner in that one, a shock to not only us here, but college football fans around the entire world. One of the biggest upsets in recent college football history, regardless of conference. And this is an Alabama team that's going to have to get things figured out now, going back home, welcoming South Carolina into Tuscaloosa on Saturday. And it's an 11 a.m. kickoff, so it'll be interesting to see kind of what the crowd reaction is like. Are the fans ready to get up and go after a very disappointing loss to Vanderbilt? Are they ready to support the team? And really the question is, though, what kind of Alabama are we going to see on Saturday? Are we going to continue to see the trend from the last 6 quarters that we've seen of Alabama, where you go back to the second half of the Georgia game and all throughout Vanderbilt, and the defense just really didn't have any answers for what either of those teams were doing offensively speaking? You let Georgia go 5 for 5 on fourth down in the second half of that game. You give up 12 third down conversions to Vanderbilt last week. Coming into the game against Vanderbilt, Alabama had only allowed opponents to convert on 11 third down conversions the entire season, and then they give up 12 in the single game to Vanderbilt. Not a good look, and a lot of concern around the defense specifically moving forward for Alabama. But I think, as many people would expect, I think Kane Womack, not to say that he's not a hard worker every single week, I think maybe he's working a little overtime this week. We'll just put it that way, because that lasting impression from last week was very, very ugly, and a lot of fans not happy. Offensively, you still looked pretty good. I don't think many people have question marks about Jalen Milroe, Ryan Williams making spectacular plays again, which just seems to be happening on a week-by-week basis now. But it's really about this defense, Damian, and coming out with an aggressive attitude and aggressive mindset, and just seeming like they're on the same page, whether it's communication. We've heard Malachi Moore talk about maybe some of the helmet communication needs to get shored up, and maybe some of the timing on that has been a complication for Alabama defensively speaking. But at the end of the day, you have a South Carolina team coming in that only scored 3 points last week in their game against Ole Miss. So it seems like this potentially sets up very well for a rebound effort from an Alabama defense that really needs to get some momentum before the October 19th matchup with Tennessee.
Absolutely. I think this is the perfect get-right game for Alabama. After what you saw against Vanderbilt, and it really felt that game really was boiled down to third down conversions. And it felt like it was third and short. Even if it was third and medium, it felt like Vanderbilt was always in control when it came to third down. Even one fourth down play, the big touchdown they had over the top. But it's one of those things where if there were any issues that you saw on the backstretch of Georgia, it reared its ugly head against Vanderbilt. And Vanderbilt, again, they have improved everywhere. You add Diego Pavia and just where that team is now, I would have never thought going into that game that Vanderbilt really had a chance. I thought that the gap was still big enough that Alabama's talent would still be able to overcome a little bit of whatever adversity that Vanderbilt was going to throw at them. And to me, it even goes back to the Missouri matchup for Vandy of, okay, this team is for real. It wasn't just a splash in the pan. It also makes me look at Missouri a little bit different. But now for Alabama, especially with South Carolina coming in, and for what you saw that Ole Miss, one thing about Ole Miss, they have improved on defense, and it never looked like South Carolina even had a thought of threatening them going down the field. And I think for Alabama, that's probably what you wanted to see. Like, you're looking at this offense, and Lenore Sellers and Rocket Sanders, those are the two pieces that South Carolina must have. And, going into last week, they were on the availability report. Like, they were questionable going into that game, and maybe they weren't at 100%, so they weren't clicking. Well, now you're not 100%, and then you follow that up with Alabama that just lost a football game. And to your point, I think offensively, there's still no issues. There aren't any question marks for Jalen Milroe. We pretty much know exactly what we're going to get from him as far as the passing game is concerned and those receivers that they have. I think it was interesting that not that they needed to run the ball, but it didn't seem like they were making a concerted effort to run the football. And I think they had some opportunities where, looking back on it, I know Kalen DeBoer's probably looking at the offensive tape of, well, why didn't we run it on 2nd and 6? Why didn't we, continue to pound the rock on, 2nd and short and not just go for the big plays? So I think right now for Alabama, especially with an 11 o'clock kickoff, you want the defense to at least show us that you have made the week-to-week adjustments, because it felt like Georgia, okay, well, it was a late surge there at the end. Maybe they got lackadaisical on some things because they felt comfortable. But then you follow that up with what Vanderbilt was able to do at every level, out-scheme you in certain situations. Vanderbilt had 418 total yards against Alabama. I thought the stat was insane, even going back looking at it. But there were plays that Diego Pavia made with his arm, with his legs, just from play design. And if you're South Carolina, you're probably taking a little bit of some of those formations, some of those triple option things, and probably saying, hey, Lenores, we may not ask you to throw the ball a lot, but we're probably going to hit you with some option things, a lot of RPOs, and probably focus a little bit more on the run game, because I do think the Alabama defensive line is completely different from what we've seen in years past. Mm-hmm. There's just not that dude. There's no Quentin Williams falling out of that locker room. There's no, Dallas Turner or Will Anderson to bookend a lot of things. So they're still looking for those guys defensively up front. And for the linebackers, I mean, it's probably one of the worst games Jahad Campbell had just collectively. And I think that's probably the biggest issue, that your front seven wasn't as strong as they needed to be. And I think for South Carolina, if they're going to find a way to keep this thing, close or even a dogfight in certain situations, they're going to have to attack the front seven. And, South Carolina's offensive line isn't ideally the best in the conference, but I do think with Rocket Sanders, who's played at Arkansas a couple of years, he knows this Alabama, defense. He knows the landscape. He knows exactly what he's getting into in Tuscaloosa. I think it's just going to be interesting to see what this defense does to respond from everything that they left on the table against Vanderbilt.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the bigger concerns, if you're an Alabama fan looking at what you just said, is coming into the year, you felt like you had a lot of questions around the secondary and the youth there. And at least in my opinion, up to this point, there are things that you could go back and look at. Okay, maybe in the second half against Georgia, they got a little lax and let too many big plays happen. But for the most part, I feel like the secondary's been solid. Granted, you haven't played outside of Carson Beck, I guess quarterbacks that many would consider elite. Maybe some of you consider Diego Pavia to be that now. But I think just going into this game, you need to see the defensive line be able to get some pressure, because to their credit, while it didn't look like you've seen Alabama defensive fronts in the past, against Georgia at least, they were able to make Carson Beck uncomfortable, especially in that first half, and he turned the ball over multiple times. And for you to not be able to do that same thing against Vanderbilt is concerning. And the linebackers are, you bring up a great point there too, because defensively speaking, coming into the year, you would have said, I don't really have any concerns about what Deontay Lawson and Jahad Campbell are going to do there. And it was certainly an off day for them, and just tackling in general just was not at its best against Vanderbilt on Saturday. And that's certainly something that you want to see Alabama improve upon this week. I just think it's such an interesting matchup, because in pretty much essentially every offensive category, Alabama has the statistical advantage. On the defensive side, it's pretty much all South Carolina. South Carolina is actually a top 25 defense statistically in the country up to this point in the season. So again, I think, Alabama's offense will ultimately trump South Carolina's defense, in my opinion. It's just going to be more so a matter of how good does this defense look, because you want to win the game, and that is first and foremost the most important thing. But I think, just speaking to the fan base of Alabama, I think you want to see a dominant performance that gives you confidence, because not only is a win very, very important, but it's about building momentum for the game that you have looming in a week and a half against Tennessee, because that is going to be a game where, if Alabama loses that game, and we'll talk about it next week, you're in a win out scenario if you want to have a chance of making the college football playoff. So that one's going to be very, very interesting. And I think we will learn a lot about Alabama and really the coaching staff and the culture as a whole and just how they respond to the defeat to Vanderbilt last week. And I think a lot of fans are excited and maybe a little nervous about what we're going to see from Alabama. But we saw this happen a number of times in the Saban era. I understand it's a different era. But I would bet my money on Alabama coming out and looking a lot sharper than they did against Vanderbilt. And, potentially we're looking back on that game a few months from now as that was kind of the kick in the rear end that Alabama needed to, kind of put a strong second half of the season together and potentially make another trip to the college football playoff. So that's our thoughts on Alabama and South Carolina. But boy, oh boy, last weekend was the craziest weekend of college football with all the upsets. But I think just on paper, looking at the schedule for this weekend, there are so many great matchups we have to talk about. Ole Miss and LSU, Red River rivalry, a top 3 matchup between Ohio State and Oregon, and that's just scratching the surface of what we have. So when we come back here on Countdown to Kickoff, we will dive into some of those other exciting matchups we have coming up this weekend in college football. You're listening to Jocks 94.5.
Welcome back into Jocks Countdown to Kickoff. Damian Mitchell alongside Conrad Van Order, Molly Robinson hold things down behind the scenes. Presented by our friends at Dread River Distilling Company. And we cannot tell you enough about Dread River. It is absolutely wonderful. You can go in there. You can rent a room on the side. You have your own little space. If you just want to have a little get together with some friends. I mean, they have anything you can think of from bourbon, gin, whiskey, and a lot of these things that they sell, they have right here in front of us. They sell in-house, and it's all made there, man. It's one of the more unique experiences that we had a chance to go and see this week, man. It was awesome. Located at 2400 7th Avenue South, downtown Birmingham, and I'm telling you, it is absolutely magnificent. And we got a chance to eat their food, man. The menu is extensive. We had the chance to eat some of their steak quesadillas, and I promise you,
it's probably the best steak quesadilla I've ever had.
It's
very good.
My mouth is watering just talking about it, just thinking about it, because it's how good it was, and all the people that are there, they're so awesome, and they're great to, sponsor us on this show, man. And it's been a lot of fun, and we continue that partnership. And make sure the next time you go down there, tell them Damian and Conrad told you first. And I'm telling you, it's going to be a wonderful experience. But a lot of teams that we have last week that we thought were going to be cakewalks, not necessarily bringing up Alabama again, Conrad, I'm sorry about that. But they end up falling.
We're moving on.
Yeah, exactly. They end up falling to Vanderbilt. And we have Ole Miss. And Ole Miss, after a win against South Carolina, taking on LSU down in Baton Rouge. It's a night game. They're at 6:30 on ABC. And really and truly, it's probably going to become a battle of the defensive side, because we have reached this point in this day and age of college football, 2024, where Ole Miss defense is arguably one of the best, if not the best, in the country. And who's their defense coordinator, Conrad?
Pete Golden.
You don't say. And they said he couldn't do it in Titletown, USA, but he could do it in Oxford, Mississippi. But no, when you look at what this game is probably going to entail, you got 2 of the best quarterbacks in the league with Garrett Nussmeier at LSU and with Jackson Dart at Ole Miss. Lane Kiffin, if you are going to get, quote unquote, the big one, this is the one you're going to have to get. And it's going to be, you've already lost one. You had your mulligan with Kentucky, and you've been able to bounce back with the win over South Carolina. But I think for LSU, you're starting to figure out who your team is at the right time. And at this point, I think that offensively, no, they're not what they were last year with Jaden Daniels, but they're still putting up numbers. And I think for Ole Miss, this is probably going to be your biggest test defensively of what LSU is able to do. They're actually making a point to run the football a little bit more. We know what Kyron Lace and those receivers are going to do. But I will say this, Garrett Nussmeier, he's shown in numerous times he'll serve you up one. So I think the secondary is going to be on high alert, and I don't expect it to be another 55-52 matchup.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't surprise me if it does get to that point, because LSU's offense is starting to reel. And we know defensively they're still having some issues. And I think that for South Carolina a couple weeks ago to give LSU that kind of scare and that kind of shakeup, I think it kind of sets a bad omen when you have an explosive offense like Ole Miss, and it's not going to be because Jackson Dart is throwing it, to the other team. It's you're genuinely going to have to make him rattled, get him outside the pocket, because that's exactly what Kentucky did. Their front seven made it absolute hell for Ole Miss offensively, and that's how they ended up winning that ball game. But I do think this is probably one of the 2 best offenses we've seen. And the fact they're going head to head down in Baton Rouge, I mean, of course, we know what a night game is like in LSU. Is Ole Miss truly ready to make that jump? And it starts with the game against LSU this weekend.
Yeah, this is a game that, I guess you technically don't have to win it, but it would be really, really nice to win it because you still have to play Georgia if you're Ole Miss, and we know how that matchup's gone in recent memory. On top of the fact, you go back to that win last year over LSU in an incredible game. That's Lane Kiffin's best win in his time in Oxford. And so if you're able to now replicate that again this year, that's going to be big. And, before getting into, the nitty-gritty, the X's and O's, whatever you want to call it, of the game itself, there are two things that actively are going against Ole Miss heading into this game. The first one is LSU had a bye last week, and the second one is the game's in Baton Rouge. And Ole Miss has beaten LSU in Baton Rouge one time in the last 22 years. So that's not exactly the best track record if you go back historically, in the 21st century with this matchup for Ole Miss, but it's hard not to like Ole Miss because of what they have on the defensive side of the ball, like you brought up. I mean, you look at these teams offensively speaking, you're kind of splitting hairs, right, in terms of which one you like a little bit more. Okay, maybe you like the running game of LSU or of Ole Miss a little bit more than LSU. Garrett Nussmeier and Jackson Dart have been equally good. Jackson Dart a little bit more of a threat with his legs, and then Trey Harris and what he's done and what Aaron Anderson and Kyron Lacey have done for LSU on the receiving side of things, it's pretty evenly matched. But I think LSU or Ole Miss is operating at a pretty significant advantage on the defensive side of the ball. Granted, you haven't really had to play a big-time quarterback yet. And so that one, I think, favors LSU a little bit because how battle-tested really is this Ole Miss defense when, you held South Carolina to 3 points. That's impressive. But you give up 20 in the loss to Kentucky. You gave up 13 to Georgia Southern, 6 to Wake Forest, and 3 to MTSU. So you're not used to having to battle back if you're in a situation where, say, Ole Miss is trailing 21-14 early in a football game and you're giving up more points than you have at any point in the season so far and you're trailing, you're on the road, it's a night game. How are you going to respond to that? And so I think that this game certainly sets up well for LSU with the environment and the atmosphere of everything. But I do wonder if maybe there's a little bit more of that sense of urgency for Lane Kiffin of, LSU losing to USC in the first week of the season. I think we all have moved on from that and realized that USC, I know they have 2 losses now and just lost to Minnesota, but they're a respectable team. And not to say that Kentucky's not, but to lose to them at home and to have your offense completely inept in that game, I think raised a lot of flags for some people. So it's hard for me not to think that Ole Miss is ultimately going to be able to, and maybe it is just one extra stop that they're able to get defensively, but they are significantly better on that side of the ball than what LSU is. And that doesn't mean that you can't have, things that go LSU's way. That doesn't mean that you can't have, turnovers are a huge part of this game. If Ole Miss, loses the turnover battle, then I can certainly see a path for LSU to come away with the victory. And it's a tough environment. You don't know what that's going to play out like. You don't know how that's going to affect communication. I think this is a very, very interesting game. And I'll be honest, though, I think if anybody just tells you straight up, oh, this team is absolutely winning on Saturday, I feel like they're kind of lying to you because this one's just so hard to predict between the atmosphere being in Baton Rouge, the history of this matchup, and how it doesn't favor Ole Miss at all. And, we still have the questions about Lane Kiffin and these kinds of opportunities. You got it last year, but that's no guarantee this year. And there's certainly a lot of pressure on him in Oxford right now with that loss to Kentucky to make the college football playoff because this season's going to be a failure for Ole Miss if you don't find yourself in that 12-team playoff. And I think that has to take a toll on you at least a little bit there. But I'm so excited for this game. It looks like it's going to be around 80 degrees for kickoff. It should be great weather down there in Baton Rouge. And I'm just so excited to see how this one plays out because whoever wins this matchup is going to be in a very strong position to be a college football playoff team because if you're Ole Miss, you win this game, I think you can survive a loss to Georgia. It might be tough and it's not going to be ideal, but I think you're going to potentially be able to survive that. And if you're LSU, okay, maybe you drop this game, but you still have that Alabama game on the schedule, and that's going to be a big one as well as Texas A&M, Oklahoma. They have some opportunities, but if you're Ole Miss, it really comes down to this game in Georgia, and so this is going to be a must-have game for Lane Kiffin and the Rebels.
I agree with you 100%. And when you look at Ole Miss's defensively, they lead the nation in sacks. They have 24 in the season, and it's just so unique that we're looking at what Lane Kiffin has done offensively, and that's just kind of been his calling card. But there's a concerted effort of, no, we need our defense to not just be good, but be great. Just think of where, Josh Heupel is with Tennessee right now. We're almost questioning their offense because we're not even worried about the defensive side of the ball now. And over the past couple seasons, we would have never thought this. But I think right now for Ole Miss, you're banking on, okay, our defense, this may be your biggest challenge, but if you continue to play at the level that you have been, yes, I think Ole Miss should win the ball game. But like you said, history doesn't really show that down there in Baton Rouge for them. So I just
There's a reason we play the games, right?
Exactly. And I think it's just going to be an exciting matchup all the way around for both Ole Miss and LSU. So we got some more games to take a look at, too. I mean, the Red River rivalry's coming up, and that's got an SEC feel to it now.
I have forgotten so many times of, I'm looking forward to that game, and then I remember, it's a conference, it's an SEC conference game. That's going to take some getting used to.
Absolutely. We'll discuss that and so much more around the SEC here on Jocks 94.5 Countdown to Kickoff, presented by our friends at Red River.
Welcome back into Countdown to Kickoff here on Jocks 94.5. Conrad Van Order, Damian Mitchell with you, and Molly Robinson here holding things down for us. And as always, we are brought to you by our friends at Red River Distilling Company. You can find them at 2400 7th Avenue South. And we've talked a lot about our experience there, Damian, and just the wonderful hospitality they have had, all of the options they have, from the full menu bar with all the handcrafted cocktails, all the ingredients that are made in-house there at Red River, full-service kitchen, an event venue. I know when we were out there, they mentioned that they were having a wedding out there. And I go, okay, so is it going to be a smaller wedding? And they said, no, it's 150 people, and they are able to completely accommodate that. And it looked beautiful the way that it was set up. And so, make sure you check them out for, your next date night, a high school reunion, a wedding reception, anything like that. They will have you covered there at Dread River, located on 7th Avenue South downtown in Birmingham. And make sure you go to your local ABC store, your local package store, and ask them for their Dread River selection of spirits, because they are going to keep you nice and satisfied like they do here on Countdown to Kickoff. Well, we spent a little bit of time breaking down Alabama, South Carolina, LSU, Ole Miss, two of the bigger games in the SEC, but a game that we have to get used to saying this is now an SEC matchup, but one of the biggest rivalries in the sport, Damon, that is the Red River rivalry, which will take place at the Cotton Bowl between the Texas Longhorns and the Oklahoma Sooners. And this is going to be, again, it's a rivalry game, so we know you can kind of throw a lot of things out the window in these types of matchups. But Texas right now, I think, firmly looks like the best team in the country. Granted, we could say maybe they haven't had the toughest schedule up to this point, which would be fair. I mean, the big win at Michigan, I think, impressed a lot of people, but Michigan maybe not looking like a top 25 team this year, so maybe that win has lost a little bit of its luster. But Oklahoma, of course, they had the one loss on the season, losing to Tennessee, in a game that I thought they were more competitive than I was expecting, honestly. I thought they did some things well defensively to limit Nico and that Tennessee offense, but offensively speaking, it's been a rough go of things from the jump since Jackson Dart. He got benched in that game against Tennessee. Now you got Michael Hawkins Jr. who comes in, has that opening, 60-plus yard touchdown run against Auburn, and you go, oh, I see why they recruited this kid. And, for the next 58 minutes of that ball game or so, it was a little hit or miss. So going into this game, it's going to be very interesting to see how these teams look. You got some good news if you're Texas, though. We found out Quinn Ewers is expected to return from his injury, and he will be the starting quarterback from Texas in this matchup. But you look on the Oklahoma side of things, and Deion Burks, your best receiver, he's going to miss another game. He was out in the Auburn game. He is now going to miss this week as well. So some good news for Texas, bad news for Oklahoma. And when you really break down this matchup, Damian, it seems to be quite lopsided, at least in the way that I look at it. Texas is one of 4 teams in the country to be both top 10 offensively and defensively. They have been the second best defense. We were just talking about Ole Miss and how good they've been, being a top 3 defense. Well, Texas is the number 2 defense in the country, only trailing Ohio State. They have been absolutely magnificent this year, giving up exactly 7 points a game. And then you look at things for Oklahoma, where they're averaging 28 points a game offensively. Granted, that big win, 49-point win over Temple to start the season, is maybe making that look a little better than it is in reality. But you look at what Texas is doing offensively. I mean, they're averaging 45 points a game, going up against a good Sooners defense, but one that Auburn was able to move the ball against quite effectively. So I think it's probably going to be a long day for the Sooners fans in this matchup, Damian. But again, it is a rivalry matchup. You never really know how these games are going to turn out.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the history of the Red River, it's kind of interesting. Texas leads the series 63-51, and there's 5 ties. Last season, Texas lost this game and still ended up in the college football playoff.
Yep,
like
it was the only loss.
Yeah, it was the only loss of the regular season, and it's so unique to see Texas in this mode, because even if you go back the last 5 matchups, the one time they won was 2022. That was the last time Texas won this game,
and it was what 55-0,
a complete blowout, a complete beatdown. So like this, if Texas on paper, it shouldn't be much of a ball game. It really shouldn't. But there are just so many things that go into what happens down there in Dallas. I mean, it's a big party. It's just a big festival weekend. But I do think if you've watched Texas and you watched Oklahoma, you've seen two separate teams. Like when Texas locks in, they're one of the best teams in the country. Oklahoma, okay, you had some question marks early on, like, man, Jackson Arnold just isn't looking right. Like he's kind of figured some things out. The close wins over Houston and Tulane. Then they pull him against Tennessee. They put in Michael Hawkins Jr. He makes his first start against Auburn. They end up winning that ball game. Now, granted, it's maybe one play may have changed that entire game, but I do think for Oklahoma, you're going to have to shorten it up, because I do think the possessions that you're going to have are going to be limited. And on the other side, Texas, I mean, when you watch Sark, he's very methodical. Like he's surgical with it. All of a sudden, he'll have a play call in the first quarter that you may not see again until late in the fourth, and all of a sudden, boom, it's a touchdown. So I think that for Sark, yes, it's a rivalry game, but just don't overthink it, because right now I think on both sides of the ball, you have the advantage. And I think for Texas, you're almost at this point where, especially after Alabama falls to Vanderbilt and that matchup looming at the end of the season with Texas A&M, if you can go over these next couple weeks and start with the Red River rivalry, you can set yourself up nice to be pretty much the last great American dynasty here in college football. And I think it could be interesting to see how this thing is going to go, but I think that you're in a great position right now with Quinn coming back and being healthy. We saw what Arch was able to do. He's living up to the Manning name, and again, he's only a sophomore, so it's not like we've seen the full package, and he held the fort just fine with Quinn not being there. But now you're getting your veteran starter back, and I just think right now the recipe is don't overthink it, run what we run, do what we do best, and they should handle their business against Oklahoma. Yeah,
it's hard to find a place on paper, at least, where Oklahoma has a big advantage in this one. Maybe you could go and say with a guy like a Danny Stutzman, a linebacker, that you want to give the Sooners a lead somewhere like that. But I've just been... overall, I've been so impressed with Texas coming into the SEC. They have one of the best offensive lines in the country, one of the best offenses overall, one of the best quarterbacks. I mean, their defensive front has been incredible. Their secondary has been it's just all around. They have been, in my opinion, the most complete team in college football. But this is probably going to be the toughest test that you've faced, being a rivalry game in the environment, all the emotion that goes into that. I know it's not going to Ann Arbor to play. And, maybe you could say, well, you don't want to catch Texas looking ahead to Georgia because that is who they play next weekend. But it being a rivalry game, I really don't think that that's going to happen. And even if, let's say, Quinn Ewers comes back and he looks a little rusty, Arch Manning's played pretty darn well the last couple of weeks. So I think they're going to feel comfortable with whatever happens there. So it's, this is one for Texas that I think you should have. I don't think Dylan Gabriel's going to be walking through that door again. He has a pretty big game himself this weekend. So I'm sorry to the Oklahoma fans there. But, we did see them again against a Tennessee team be able to cause them some problems. And this is, it's going to be a tough one for Oklahoma, though. I just think that offensively speaking, I haven't seen anything that gives me a lot of confidence moving forward that they found something here in the last week or two that is going to drastically change how that offense looks and how they execute. So it's it's going to be an exciting one. We will have, I'm sure, a lot of conversation of, oh, y'all sure the Iron Bowl's the best rivalry in the SEC after what we saw in downtown Dallas last week? Well, yeah, I think the Iron Bowl's still the best, but it's okay. We have room for multiple big rivalries here in the SEC. So we'll see how it all plays out between Texas and Oklahoma this weekend. But again, man, I mean, we've talked about 3 massive games here. Maybe the biggest game of the weekend, nationally speaking, Ohio State and Oregon. a 2 versus 3 matchup. We still have to talk to that, as well as a number of other great SEC matchups. I know Tennessee and Florida, maybe that one's a little interesting. And what will Vanderbilt do for their encore of the upset win against Alabama? Just so much going on this weekend. We come back here on Countdown to Kickoff, continue to break down what you can expect this weekend across the world of the SEC and college football as a whole. You're listening to Countdown to Kickoff right here on Jocks 94.5.
Welcome on back into Jocks Countdown to Kickoff. Damian Mitchell, Conrad Van Order, Molly Robinson hold things down behind the glass. And as always, we're brought to you by our friends at Dread River. And we're not just saying this. You have got to go to 2400 7th Avenue South. You have got to get down there. Listen, all their handcrafted bourbons and spirits, they're all made in-house. We've seen it. We almost had to take a shift because we were so dialed in of like, oh, we might as well go ahead and make a few while we're here. And there's just so many things, from the food to just the ambiance of just being in there. Again, they have private rooms on the side if you want to just have a nice drink, a date night, just want you and your lover. I'm telling you, it is absolutely awesome. You have got to get down there and make sure you tell them Damian and Conrad sent you. And of course, Conrad, we got to talk about the old Big Ten Classic that we are used to with the Oregon Ducks and the Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State traveling out to Eugene, Oregon. And literally, it's a top 3 matchup, the number 2 team, number 3 team in the nation with the Oregon Ducks and Ohio State Buckeyes. And to be honest, now Ohio State has looked good, but it's that old question mark. Against who? Who have they played? One thing I will say, Jeremiah Smith, for all the excitement that we have down here in the South with Ryan Williams as a freshman receiver, watch out for number 4.
I was about to say, I would say him and Ryan Williams are equally as good. Yeah.
They are some absolute dogs. And I think also for Oregon, you've escaped a few. Dylan Gabriel's had these past couple games where it's like, wait a minute, dog, you've played a lot of football. You can't have red zone interceptions. And I know Tez Johnson is your number 1 guy, but you can't just continue trying to force it to him. And I think
Evan Stewart's pretty good too, man.
That is true. That's what I'm saying. Like, you have to find the balance. But I do think that this is probably going to be one of the best games that we see all weekend long, because one, we're going to get the real test for Ohio State, where they can go pound for pound, they can go blow for blow with you on the Oregon side of things. And I do think for Oregon, it's, are you for real? Like, are you ready to compete at the highest level with the team that you have now in the Big Ten? And I think for both of these teams, one thing I will say about Ohio State is they're versatile. Like, they're not asking Will Howard to go out there and be C.J. Stroud 2.0 or Dwayne Haskins 2.0. No, it's we've got Quinshon and Trevion back there in the backfield too. So if push comes to shove, we'll just hand this thing off and chew the clock. And I do think Ryan Day offensively is one of the better play callers that we've seen over the past couple seasons. But also Dan Lanning, a young, fiery defensive guy, he's going to try to have an answer for everything. But I do think you're going to get an explosive heavyweight fight from both of these teams. But I think for Oregon is, can you truly match the physicality down in and down out for what Ohio State's going to bring?
Yeah, I mean, we might as well call this countdown to the number 1 defense in the country instead of countdown to kickoff, because we started off with Ole Miss at 3, then we talked about Texas, who's number 2, and then Ohio State, who is the best defense in the country, giving up under 7 points per game. They're only giving up 202 yards per game. Total yards. Through the first month and a half or so of the season. Absolutely incredible. And, like you were saying, Damian, I think this game is very intriguing. Obviously, it's a top 3 matchup. It's intriguing, but I think we're going to figure out which one of these teams, and maybe it's both of them, are really for real. Because Ohio State, I haven't seen anything that would necessarily, would consider a knock against Ohio State. It's just maybe they haven't been as dominant as people expected with the huge, the $20 million, whatever it was that they spent on their roster for this season. And then the Oregon side, I mean, they had some people worried the first few weeks of the season. I mean, Idaho to start off, that was an ugly game. I think Boise State, in retrospect, that's more of a credit to how good Ashton Genty is, but also Boise State. But they've started to clean things up since then. I mean, you even look at the game last week against Michigan State. All right, you win by 21. That was a good win, but Dylan Gabriel had multiple interceptions early in that game in the red zone. That's something that concerns you. I mean, if you had told me coming into this game that Will Howard would have more touchdown passes on the season than Dylan Gabriel, I don't think I would have believed you. And that's not a knock on Will Howard. It's just, I think a lot of us looked at Dylan Gabriel as potentially the best quarterback in college football this season, and there's been some growing pains there for him in Eugene, and you wonder if part of it is just he's a different style of quarterback than Bo Nix, right? With Bo Nix, it was a lot of checkdowns. It was a lot of letting him scramble and use his legs. And Dillon Gabriel's just more of your prototypical pocket passer kind of quarterback. And, like you said, there's been some times where it feels like he's forcing the ball to a certain receiver. And, they have so much talent there, whether it is Tez Johnson, who's that number one guy, and Evan Stewart that came over from A&M, and Trayshawn Holden, who came over from Alabama a couple years ago. He's found himself a really nice niche there as the third receiver for Oregon. So they have a ton of weapons. This is by far going to be the biggest test for either one of these teams going into it. But then you look at the Ohio State side of things, and it's just that two-headed monster that you have in the backfield with Judkins and Henderson. I mean, that is one of the best running back rooms we've seen in recent college football history. You add in Will Howard, a guy who, again, maybe he doesn't jump off the charts as just this elite quarterback, but he doesn't turn the ball over. Only 3 interceptions on the year to go with 12 touchdowns. He's been exactly what they needed him to be. And when you compare a guy like Emeka Egbuka, who has been one of the best receivers in college football going back 3 or so years now, and you bring in a Jeremiah Smith like you were talking about, who is, right up there with Ryan Williams is the best. And I know a lot of people around here probably don't watch Ohio State as much, but I promise you this kid is just as good as Ryan Williams. Like they might be the 2 best receivers in college football, and they're both true freshmen. Like that's how good Jeremiah Smith is and has been for Ohio State this year. He's their leading receiver. I just feel like the defense for Ohio State has been so dominant, but you're having to go on the road. And what is that like for Oregon? This is their first big Big Ten matchup, their first time in that environment, but getting people to come to Autzen Stadium, that's certainly going to give them an advantage. I just feel like, to me at least, Dillon Gabriel hasn't looked like the Dillon Gabriel of the past. And if he doesn't find that form for this game on Saturday, I just think it's going to be tough for Oregon to pull out the victory because of how dominant Ohio State has been defensively.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%, especially on Dillon Gabriel. And I was extremely high on him. He was actually my pick for the Heisman Trophy to start the season. And some of the decision-making he's had these past couple games, it really brings into question, like, hey, big dog, like, are you seeing the field right? Like, what's going on? You just got a case of trying to try to force it into a lot of these guys. But I do think for Oregon is, can you match up physically? Like, I mean, this is a rematch from a national championship game and one of the best college quarterbacks we've ever seen in Marcus Mariota. He's not walking through that door. No. He's not going to be able to save you. And I mean, even he lost to Ohio State during that time. But I do think that for Dillon Gabriel, this is kind of, you can look at it as like you get right. If you are going to put Oregon where they want to be or where they need to be.
We're not going to have any doubts about you after this if you go out there and show out.
Not a single question mark after that. But I do think for Ohio State, just because of how physical they are defensively, I do think they have a little bit more of an edge than what Oregon is going to present to them. So if I had to pick right now, I'd probably lean Ohio State to win that ball game.
Yeah, it's again, I feel like we're splitting hairs with that one. And for the record, if you're somebody that looks to this to make decisions on who you think is going to win a football game, they played 3 times in the past. You had the national championship game you brought up, which Ohio State won. Then you also had another Ohio State victory back in the 2009 season in a New Year's Six bowl game. But Oregon did win the last matchup in Columbus, Ohio, and as I'll be completely honest, I think we both forgot, that was an Oregon team that was not led by Bo Nix. That was an Anthony Brown-led Oregon team that went into Columbus, Ohio, and beat an Ohio State team on a day that C.J. Stroud threw for almost 500 yards and 3 touchdowns. So, again, the latest trend, the last time we saw these teams win, Oregon was able to win with an inferior quarterback, at least on paper. So maybe that, sways how you feel about this matchup, but I think this is going to be one of the best college football games of the season. I'm not going to be surprised if we look back on it. Maybe the circumstances are different, but similarly to what we were talking about with Alabama and Georgia a couple weeks ago and just how big that game ultimately was. So very, very excited for this one. Again, Ohio State heading up to Eugene, Oregon to take on the Ducks. That game is going to be on NBC at 6:30. That will be, nationally speaking, at least the biggest game on the schedule across the college football slate for this weekend. But just looking real quick, Damian, at some other matchups we have in the SEC real quick here. You have Florida and Tennessee, Vanderbilt and Kentucky, Mississippi State and Georgia, and Missouri and UMass, which...
on the road at that. Missouri's traveling to Massachusetts.
That's an interesting one there. So, we have a lot of other matchups that you can look forward to. But those are the big ones, the ones that we wanted to break down for you here on Countdown to Kickoff. And we are another great week. Again, thank you to our sponsors, Dread River Distilling Company. If you're looking for, a little adult beverage for your college football weekend, go visit them at 2400 7th Avenue South, or again, at your ABC store, local package store. Just ask them for their selection of Dread River spirits. But that'll wrap up another great week of Countdown to Kickoff here. Again, I'm Conrad Van Order. He's Damian Mitchell. Appreciate you tuning in. We'll be back next week for a big weekend, the third Saturday in October.
Yes,
Get ready for it, and hope everyone enjoys another great weekend of college football. You're listening to Countdown to Kickoff